Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today with us we have my dear friend Lura Pollozhani. She's a scholar specialized in democracy, social movements, and the European integration of the Western Balkans. She holds a PhD from the University of Graz and Master of Science in European Studies from LSE, London. She published work on competitive authoritarianism, protest politics, minority rights, gender, and citizenship. She has also been an advisor in the Prime Minister's cabinet in North Macedonia, a member of the BIPAC group, the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, and a co-founder of the feminist association based in Skopje, Stella Network. Today, she will present the findings from her recent project named Political Realities of Gen Zs in the Western Balkans. This project has been funded by the Open Society Foundation and has been based on more than a survey in all 6 Western Balkan countries with more than 6,000 young people between 18 and 27. The research was also combined with 19 focus group discussions, and it has been already discussed among us last month in CRES, where a few of us used some of the data in this in our presentations to set up the background stage for our research. I believe that Lura and her research is highly relevant both for the region and for our individual projects, since most of us are RECAS Fellow who work in one way or another with democratization perspectives of Gen Zs in the region. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Lura. We'll have a short presentation of 30-35 minutes by Lura, and then we will open the floor for further discussion. Lura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Borjan, for such a nice introduction. And I'm so happy that the study has already been of some use. It's been a lot of work, so I'm happy somebody gets to use it and finds it useful. So hello, everyone. I'm very happy to see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, particularly Vanya, who I worked with at UNHCR. And, sometimes we get surprised at these things. Hi, Vanya. So today I will present for about half an hour, as Borjan said. And you can then ask as many questions as you want. I've opened SPSS if it doesn't crash by the end of this call, just in case you want to discuss any question in more detail. So first, I'll share my screen. Chup, chup, chup. There we go. Share. Do you guys see it?
Yes.
Perfect. So first, just a note on methodology. As Borjan mentioned, this survey, this study is it was quite large in the sense that we had 6,062 surveys. Of these, we try to be gender balanced and also have all ethnicities in the different countries included. So in the end, we had about 52% women and 48% men. And then in each country, we have a minimum of 1,000 surveys. The surveys were done in person. So they were copy surveys. There are other regional surveys that have done mixed methods. We decided to do the same method in each country because we thought this is the way that we get the best comparative data that we can use. We hired survey companies to do this research in the different countries. So in each country, we had one survey company that was local, that already knew the context and kind of had done surveys in each country before. We also a good practice I would recommend is that when we did the questionnaire, we had a workshop together with the survey companies. And this was done in order to get a questionnaire that was as usable as possible for the field. Because, of course, when I was making the questions, I also have more of a experience in a qualitative kind of research. So developing questions for a quantitative study was, it had its own challenges. So having developing the questionnaire together with the survey companies was actually a very good practice. In the end, we had 80 questions. This might surprise the ones who read the report because we don't have all 80 questions in the report. But the survey was 80 questions. The survey time took from 18 minutes to 30 minutes, depending on the country. And then we also, after finishing the surveys, we saw some of the preliminary results. And that's when I developed the guide for the focus group discussions. Then we had 3 focus group discussions per country. In the focus group discussions, we divided in different ways. So first we had the age division. The 16 to 18s were in one focus group discussion. And then the 18s or 19s to 28s were in another focus group discussion. This was because I was scared that perhaps the younger Gen Zs would not feel comfortable speaking if there were older people in the room, in the sense that they had different experiences, students to work, employees already. So we wanted to separate. And then also in the cases, for example, of Macedonia and in Kosovo, we had among the 19 and the 28s, we also had one focus group in another language. So in Macedonia, we had one in Macedonian and one in Albanian. And in Kosovo, we had one in Albanian and one in Serbian. So this kind of is a methodological note. All the data were analyzed through SPSS, and basically you'll see the results now. So we termed the research Democracy Pulse, Gen Z in the Western Balkans. What got me interested in this topic was that there was already being a lot of Gen Z data that was being published globally, and we could see kind of a new trend where we had thought that Gen Zs would be more progressive. They were turning to be not so progressive, particularly the men. So in global data, the females or women are more progressive in their political views and in their kind of societal outlook, whereas men are much more conservative even than their parents. So we wanted to see what's the situation like in the Western Balkans. What are the Gen Zs in the Western Balkans thinking about politics? What are they thinking about their societies, their kind of their futures as well. So we divided the questionnaire into these different aspects that we will go through today. The first one was the political realities of Gen Z and democracy. One aspect that we were very happy to see is that Gen Z in the region are quite committed to democracy, in the sense that they think that democracy is the best government form that we have. As you can see, more than 70% have said that yes to some degree. We also had a sub-question where we asked what other form if not democracy, and here we had a lot of responses like technocracy. So there is preference for kind of effective governments that we will explore further with the other questions. However, the most shocking data that we had was how little they wanted to be engaged with the political questions. First, when we did the surveys, all the survey companies were complaining that when we did the pilot, because first we piloted the surveys, when we did the pilot, the survey companies were like, they don't want to answer the political questions, or they want to speed through them, or they don't want to kind of go through them. But of course, I didn't remove any of these questions because the point was to look at politics, even if they found the answer, kind of the questions uncomfortable. So we kind of pushed a little bit further. We did adjust the language a little bit. For example, if we thought that the question was not being properly understood, but still there was this kind of reluctance to talk about politics at the survey level, at least. 71.1% of the respondents said that they have no interest 46% I think say no interest. The others say that slight interest. In terms of age, it's the older cohort that is a bit more interested than the other age groups. So the 25 to 29 is the most interested, but the variations are not that big. In terms of countries, because everybody asks if this is the case in all the countries, all countries, the majority say slightly to no interest. In Serbia, the data is a little bit better, but still the no interest to slight interest wins out in all the countries. However, when we went into the focus group discussion level, then we saw that actually it's not like Gen Z doesn't have any information, because if you look at the surveys, you have a sense that they're apathetic. They don't follow, they don't care about politics. But then when we get to the focus group discussions, even with the 16 to 18-year-olds, we see that they're quite informed about political issues. For example, they know who their politicians are. They have a very active critique of what their politicians are doing. With the 16 to 18-year-olds, I mean, I found it funny in the sense that, you know, in some of them, they would be like, we're so old, we're so tired of these politicians. And, you know, you have this sense of, you know, we've been living with them forever. And they're just starting to experience kind of this political scheme, but forum. But they seem to have this kind of more than disbelief in political processes, a disillusionment with them. And they didn't want to see the old faces. All of them talked about this concept of old faces in politics. They wanted new voices involved. When I cross-tabulated the data because they also believe that they have zero to no influence in politics, and that they also are very lowly represented, so they're not represented well in politics. When I cross-tabulated the data of interest with influence, for example, there was a slight positive correlation. So the fact that they feel like they have no influence could also influence the fact that they don't care, quote unquote, on politics. But then when we look at their voting patterns, or how they foresee their voting patterns, because we asked whether they would vote in the next elections, 67.7% said they would. So in this sense, there's still kind of interest in politics in the voting sense. So in this very kind of limited way. When I presented this data to Gen Zers in a workshop, so we kind of, after we did this whole study, we talked to Gen Z activists specifically, and they were shocked with the data. And then they were thinking maybe they understood politics as a political party. And we never asked them what they understood as a politics. So this also, when we talked in the focus group discussions, we did not ask them to define what politics meant. We wanted to see more how they saw the political kind of field. When it comes to why they would vote for a certain party, we also were interested about that. Youth presence in the parties was quite high up. The most high up was the party program now, and then the alignment with personal values. So these were basically the top 3 reasons for choosing to vote for a party. But of course, you also have more standard reasons that we could already foresee, like, for example, that the family votes for a certain party. We also had, for example, the opportunities for employment. People also selected that. There was also protest votes, so it was quite spread out. It was a multiple choice question, but the top 3 are in the screen. Then we asked, for example, what they would do if a leader would unlawfully take over powers. Because here, and we'll go through the ideological questions in a bit, but we saw, for example, that they had a preference for strong governments. We had already seen this, or strong leaders. We had seen this with previous surveys on youth, like the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung survey that was done with youth in the region, including Turkey and no, just plus Turkey, I think. And then we wanted to see what happens if there is a leader that takes powers unlawfully. 40% of Gen Zs, which is the majority of the respondents to this question, said that they would protest. Interestingly, in Kosovo, it's the highest amount of people who would protest, whereas we don't see so many protests in the street. And then Montenegro, 36.6%, which is the majority of the respondents in Montenegro, said that they would not care. which was quite kind of a shocking finding for us. And kind of just to juxtapose that with the 18.9%, because we had already asked Gen Zers also what kind of political activity they had chosen in the past, and the majority activity with 18.9%. So most of them, they had protested at least once. Other political activities were party membership, but that was quite low. Signing a petition, volunteering, but all of them are quite low in percentage. I can open the table later if you're interested, but it's also in the report. Now, when it comes to ideology, we were very interested to see where the winds were blowing. And we, when I got the results, first we asked, do you have an ideology? And then if yes, what is it? And then we had kind of test questions for the ideology question. Now, when I got the results, it was very hard to pin down what do I call this ideology. And also when we did the focus group discussions, the story gets even more complicated. Namely, we've termed it at the end ideologically hybrid. I don't like this word so much, but it's like a placeholder for further research, I guess. But basically, when it comes to the way that they frame their political and kind of also social understanding, it's quite conservative leaning, regardless of gender. It's progressive on the question of taxation and public services. But interestingly, they see themselves as being very progressive, or they see not necessarily themselves, but their generation. So when we asked in the focus group discussions, how do you see Gen Zers or your generation? Everybody would say, we're very progressive. But then they would kind of single themselves out of it. But when you have everybody saying the same thing about each other, it kind of feels like, kind of a self-identification as well, but also an identification of their generation. And in this sense, they saw themselves as progressive. But whenever they would answer this question, they would be like, we are progressive, but we also, we should keep some traditional values. We should, the family should be between a man and a woman. The question of LGBTQ plus communities was actually the question where they were the most conservative. Even if our test questions in the survey, this comes out, but also in the focus group discussions, it's the LGBTQ plus question that defines whether they see themselves as being progressive or not. So this is where they put the but aspect. Another thing is that for Gen Zers, what we saw throughout the survey, the focus group discussions, also my own research on the topic and doing interviews for kind of getting more into it, has been that family is very central for Gen Z. So they filter a lot of things through their family. This includes public services. So for example, they really care about health services because they care also whether, their parents get sick or their family gets sick. They care about the kind of social services because of the same issue. So I wasn't surprised to see a preference for higher taxation in exchange for better public services, because they do care about quality education, they do care about quality healthcare, and they do see these as being the two things that are perhaps the most precarious kind of areas in their countries. And they do, for example, one of the things that gets them excited is building their own family. I'm just going to see in chat if you can hear me. Okay. Croatia was not part of the survey. That's correct. These are the Western Balkan 6. Then we have, for example, that's why we have this post-ideology kind of concept, because it seems to be that when they frame their political understanding, it's more about practicalities and less about ideology. Only 20% of the respondents said that they had an ideology, 23%, I believe. And then out of those, most percentage, I think it was 7.6, were left to left leaning, and then right to right leaning, and then a left leaning. I think the difference is 2% between them. So it's not much of a difference. In Serbia, I think there's where the left leaning is higher, but again, it's a 1 to 2 percentage point. Oh, sorry. Now, Another thing that I wanted to cover on the post-ideology question is that we had, for example, one question on strong governments. Here they prefer strong governments. They prefer keeping traditional values. They prefer keeping to national identity. They prefer, on the questions on gender, they had, for example, when it comes to, they said it's good to have equal rights with men and women. But then when we asked them whether they thought that gender equality measures have given an unfair advantage to women, again, a majority of the respondents agreed, and more women than men agreed with this. So it kind of, here I have a kind of a dilemma whether they understood the question properly. And then second, maybe they did, and they do think that gender equality measures or positive discrimination has given women an unfair advantage. And in that case, women are in this sense more, let's say, conservative. But when it comes to, for example, LGBTQ plus questions, women are more tolerant and more open than men. Both, we saw this in the focus group discussions, but also in the survey. And with LGBTQ plus question, that is although we have a good percentage that agreed with the statement and strongly agreed, it's still the lowest level kind of agreement that they have through the question. So it shows that is kind of the point where they feel the most sensitive on. We also wanted to see what they think about the EU. Here, I was shocked personally when I first did kind of a pre-study on this in Kosovo with Gen Zs, and I did interviews and focus group discussions for kind of a personal research project, and it turned out in the interviews that nobody basically mentioned the EU. Nobody talked about EU values or whatever. Nobody talked about entering the EU or anything like that. They would talk about Germany. They would talk about single countries, but they wouldn't talk about the EU kind of as this kind of mission or vision or whatever, which I had found previously with interviewing, for example, millennial activists. So we wanted to see how they see the EU next. 76.2% of Gen Z would support their countries joining the EU. Either they said it's important or it's not important, but they would still like to see it happen. But in the focus group discussions, I saw a very kind of interesting dynamic, because the way that they spoke about joining the European Union was very different from, in my experience, older generations, in the sense that they understood that they don't want to get in the EU with the current political elites. Several of them in several countries, but especially in Bosnia with the 16-year-olds to 18-year-olds, this made me laugh, is that they're like, if we enter the EU, they'll just steal bigger with these guys. So the idea that these corrupt elites in their perception would basically also get to benefit from the EU, and they didn't want to see this happen. They also didn't believe that the countries are ready for the EU. In the focus group discussions, they thought a lot of reform needed to happen, and also they were more focused on this reform as reform rather than reform for the European Union. So in that sense, they saw it quite differently. Also, when it comes to kind of joining the EU, sometimes they could also be kind of critical in the sense of, is the EU the best option? Not necessarily in the sense of values, as we assume sometimes when we look at the data, but more in the sense of, does it mean that most of the people from our country are going to leave? Does it mean that, we're going to have less workers here because they're all going to migrate to the EU countries, to other EU countries? So basically, they had a very kind of critically informed discussion of the EU, which to me was a good sign, because I think this is basically the healthy conversation that we need to be having about joining. But then when we look into kind of the future, although they see that their countries are not ready to join the EU yet, but then if you look at the data on by when they think their countries will join, it's very optimistic. So more than 50% think that it's going to happen in the next 10 years. So there is a mismatch between basically the critique that they have of how this is unfolding and by then when they think it's going to happen. Of course, when we divide this country, this is a regional perspective, and I have to say that the limit of the research in this sense is that I have focused on the regional rather than individual country dynamics. But if we separate, then we don't look at the region, but look at the countries. countries, there's a big difference. For example, of course, in Albania and in Montenegro, many more believe it's going to happen very soon. In Macedonia, Serbia, Bosnia, it's in the 45 and later bracket that most people have selected. And then Kosovo always beats the odds, because in Kosovo, they think a majority think it's going to happen in the next 10 years, although Kosovo is not a candidate country yet. Another shock here was that in Montenegro, the respondents who said that joining the EU is important was lower than we had expected, considering it's a front runner, whereas in Kosovo it was higher than in Albania. So in that sense, it doesn't seem like being part of the process itself informs both neither the optimism nor the kind of the vision that they have of an EU future. They also connect this to better quality of life. So most Gen Zers expect their living standards to match those in the EU in the next 10 years. So, and this is quite interesting, especially when we look at the next data, which is about them wanting to stay in the country. Because one of the big kind of shocks also was that 64.8% of the respondents said that they imagine their future in their countries. Also in the focus group discussions, they also spoke about basically wanting to stay and envisioning their future in their countries. Here, the importance of family comes back. They don't want to leave their families. Also, the fact that there's a different kind of a diverse experience of migration now. So a lot of them have had friends who had left and then come back because they didn't like life in quote unquote the West. So because also the fact that, we can do a lot of things, we have a lot of shops, we have a lot of opportunities you can have now in the region that you don't have to kind of leave anymore in that sense. So they seem to want to stay. The only reason they wanted to leave was better economic opportunities and better opportunities in the job market. But then if you look at their prospects for the job market, they're quite positive. So there is a tension here in the data, and sometimes we are not able to answer why, for example, they have both a very negative view of the lack of meritocratic system in the countries, but then they see that the job market is going to largely improve in the near future. So the fact that they see their future in the EU and the fact that they see a better quality of life within their countries can also explain the fact that they actually imagine their future in their countries. In the focus group discussions, also we saw a lot of patriotism rather than nationalism. So, for example, the data on the survey where we had, do you think national identity is important? I had initially kind of framed that more in a sign of nationalism, but then with the focus group discussions, it was really like a pride in how beautiful their countries are and how nice their countries are. Like in Montenegro, they spoke about, how beautiful Montenegro is and all of these things. So I think they do have this idea of, we want to stay in these countries because we really like our lifestyle here. Like, going for coffee with friends and doing all of these things, which they have seen from other friends that have migrated doesn't necessarily happen. Maybe I'm also one of these people who says, I cannot stay here anymore. Neyse. Happy and hopeful generation. So another kind of, we asked in the beginning of the survey how happy they are or how do they kind of see their kind of emotional state, because with Gen Zs we've also seen that, for example, they really care about mental health and well-being. In the focus group discussions also they spoke so much about like gym, life-work balance, kind of keeping a kind of balanced outlook on life. For them this is important. 86.6% said that they're either happy, very happy, or happy to some extent in their lives. In the focus group discussions, we ask what is a good life. And this is very, for them, because sometimes when you look at global discussions on Gen Zers, it's all about entitlement, right? And that they have this kind of crazy idea of life. But with the focus group discussions, we asked a few questions to see, quote unquote, how down to earth they are. And we could, for example, we asked how much should your salary be in order to have a dignified life in your country, or in your city, and none of them mentioned exorbitant salaries. So all of them were actually very within the range of what I would also think is a good salary to have in the region. So it was all like in the sense of being able to pay rent, being able to kind of pay for kind of the daily necessities and kind of activities. So nobody was talking about having fancy cars or whatever. So in this sense, I thought that the way, and also the way that they framed a good life is having, mental well-being, having a job, good job, having a good family, so it was really in this kind of level of kind of envisioning the future that we were talking about. They're also very hopeful. So we also asked how hopeful they are that in the next few years, 5 years, their life will get better or will improve. 71.7 said that they're very hopeful or moderately hopeful. And again, this was also in the focus group discussions. For example, they would talk about all these things that they see as being wrong or not working in their societies, but then in the end, they would be like, but it's going to get better. Or like we say in Albanian, it's going to be okay, but who's going to make it okay and how it's going to be okay? This was not a question that we were necessarily considering. And basically, this is why in the conclusion, I was led back to this theory of cruel optimism by Lauren Berlant, because I had started with this theory, but then kind of shelved it because I was like, I don't know if it's going to be applicable. And then when I saw the data, and I also presented to a friend who also kind of works with this theory, and in the beginning, she was skeptical. She was like, I don't know if it's going to fit. And then she saw the data, and she's like, this is cruel optimism in the sense of it seems like there is this positive vision, overall vision, that the countries are going to go in the right direction. But then this positive and hopeful vision is also what's blocking any sort of engagement towards achieving this. So they see the situation as not being good currently, but they think it's going to get better. But they're not engaging in order to make it better in that sense. So that's why I've kind of suggested that there needs to be more of an engagement with Gen Zs to kind of push them towards this change as well, and to engage them in political parties and institutions and systems, because as it is now, there's very little, let's say, engagement. And it is still, because they are critical, they do see what's happening with their societies, and they do have a new kind of found skill set when it comes to the way that they envision the future. For example, when it comes to questions on AI, they're very optimistic about where this is going to lead the region. These are kind of points where we can use Gen Z and their kind of new understanding of the world that can help these countries move forward. So I'll stay here. These are the polling companies in case you want to contact any of them. And I'm open to questions because I did promise to only have half an hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Lura. You're right on time. Very good. I have a few, I would say, questions or comments to start the discussion. And then I suggest to open the floor for other questions. I believe that there will be an interest for this topic. First of all, in regards the indicators on interest in politics, I think that here in the region, because of bad politics in the past 30 years and party dominance over the political, we have or young people, but also general population has a conceptual misconception of what politics means. And it's, I think, only us from social sciences and political studies who actually have a broader understanding of politics. For most of the population, politics is understood as partisanship and party politics. And I think here, in one way, from a analytical point of view, we should figure out how to, deconstruct that misunderstanding between us as researchers and the population in general. I face the same currently. I'm conducting interviews with Gen Zs, and in almost all interviews, I see that they are interested in the political, broadly speaking. However, when I ask them, do you care about politics? Most of them, at least for local politics, they say no. For global politics, where there is no, the partisanship character that they want to escape from, then they say, yeah, follow global politics. Then I'm really interested, and we already discussed with you previously, whether the data will be available in some more open format, or whether you and your team plan to publish more based on this data. Because, as you said, there are 80 questions, so that means the data is quite rich. And I would, for instance, be very interested to see how the data on income corresponds and interrelates with some of the data you just shown to us. In my research currently, I explore Gen Zs who work on digital markets and who often have quite good earnings. So, for instance, I'm very interested to see whether earning from digital markets, from abroad, from foreign clients, and so on, whether that affects the worldview they have. My strong assumption is that it does, and this is already confirmed with the interviews I have. But because of the other, methodological approach I take, I'm not sure whether I can. I'm sure I cannot generalize that finding if I don't back that up with some survey data. And my last question is in regards the way you already referred to the process of developing questions, and in the report you also mentioned that you took into consideration other questionnaires and surveys. However, I'm not sure, and I would like to hear your take on this, how comparable your questions are with the questions from other surveys. I'm particularly interested in comparing this data with general population in the Western Balkans, to contrast, to see whether, because, for instance, for voting, I would say that also general population in the Western Balkans has very high voters turnout. That is confirmed both on election days and with public opinion research. And also to compare Gen Zs from the region with Gen Zs in Europe and the US. Here I tried to do some comparisons, some very rough comparisons, and it seems like they are more prone to engage in protests than their peers in Europe. And I'm not sure whether because there are plenty of questions that were not presented today. I'm not sure whether you have some questions that are comparable with European Social Survey data or World Value Survey data. That would also be quite interesting to engage with. I mean, it seems like there is a lot of material to play around and publish couple of great papers. Thank you again for your presentation. After you address maybe these comments, we can turn to the other participants.
Thank you, Borjan. If you're interested to co-author, let me know, because I don't want to write alone anymore. But other than that, so on your questions, I'll start from the bottom up, basically, with questions on comparability. Funnily enough, a lot of surveys have copyrighted questions. So there's surveys that don't allow for you to use the same question. So sometimes what I used as a principle is I saw what all of them were asking and then tried to come up where I wanted to compare. I tried to come up with an indicator that would give me an answer to the same thing, basically, that would be comparable. Sometimes, for example, I used very similar, for example, in the regional survey, the RCC already does the Balkan survey, for example, where they ask about travel, where they ask about all these things. What I wanted to know was how youth sees all of this. Because, of course, like older people might travel more, younger people might travel less, or, I wanted to see especially how youth situates themselves in this kind of amalgam of data. So in that sense, even if I couldn't use the same question, or I thought the question with the survey companies, we thought the question wouldn't work with the target audience, we tried to adapt it in a way that we would get an answer to the same issue, but pose the question differently, or pose the question in a way that makes more sense to the local context. And yes, we do have a lot of kind of data that is not in the material. The way I excluded data was mostly where I had very low answers. For example, we've asked about the most liked personality, and this was an open answer. And very few people have given, for example, we do have answers, but very low percentages. So in this sense, I was concerned that those percentages are then going to be used to make sensational news, but they don't give us anything. Or, there's an indicator that I thought was important in the beginning, but then when I was looking at the findings, either there was, let's say 80% agreed with a certain thing, and it doesn't make sense. Because, for example, we wanted to see how connected they are in the sense of having friends and having, a social circle, but we didn't know how to frame this question properly. In the end, we came up with the word, how connected do you feel? And most people said very, and then I didn't feel like it's giving us any information. So I kept that question out. So there was very often, these questions that either in one country you had something interesting, but all the others you had almost nothing. So then I couldn't make kind of a regional finding out of that. And that's how I decided to kind of discriminate the data, because I didn't want the report to be 800 pages long. In terms of the availability of the data, at this point, it's not available anywhere as a master kind of data set. I do plan to publish academically on this, and I'm very open to also discuss with any one of you who is interested. If there's a specific question that you want to explore further, I'm, happy to kind of provide the data that I have at my disposal based on the master data. So you can have 6,062 surveys you can use also for your research. So feel free to kind of to reach out. So in terms of the digital markets, I just wanted to say that I think that is what is changing the perception of how good the markets are going to be in the future. Because while they have a lot of kind of negative comments, for example, they think public administration is not meritocratic. They think, they also don't see them as effective. When I was doing interviews, they were saying that, millennials were very mean and we don't understand the Gen Zers and we don't know how to work professionally like the way that Gen Zers do. I think that because they have so many outsourced companies, like take Kosovo, for example, they have a good kind of view of the job markets in the future, but this is dependent on other actors and not domestic actors, which I think is interesting to look at. In terms of the interest in politics, interestingly, in this data, we see that local politics is something that they're more interested in the sense that in the focus group discussions, very often they would say that they have tried to engage locally in different initiatives, but not in the capitals. We saw this in the smaller cities. And then also when we asked whether they follow politicians on social media, because politicians weren't really figuring out so much everywhere. Like we didn't see them come out. Like they would see they're tired of the old faces, but they wouldn't mention them so much, like single out someone. But then we saw that when we asked about who they follow on social media, since they said Instagram and TikTok is the main source of news, they said that they follow local politicians. So they like to follow local politicians because it affects their daily lives. But they said that they don't care so much about the national politicians or following them because it doesn't affect their lives in that direct way. I think, yeah, I mean, with the interest in politics, we always have this question of, are we asking interest in politics or something else? But then how do you ask it? In the sense of it's still politics, and I cannot determine how they see politics. But I still want to know, like, in the sense of regardless, I mean, of course, their definition matters, but again, the way that they see politics might also influence the way that they answer the question, yes, but I don't want to give kind of words into them. So I don't know. This is a tricky one. We tried to get the reason why we got focus group discussions in the first place was because we had seen the other regional data, and you could see that they're conservative, but liberal, but this, but that. So we wanted to get more into it. But yes, I mean, when you get in the focus group discussion level, you can see that partisanship is the problem. You can see that the fact that political parties have basically the same people and the same faces have occupied politics for so long is one of the reasons they're reluctant to engage. The lack of meritocracy that they see generally is also another reason that they are unwilling to engage. So in that sense, I do think that is the way that they define politics the closest. But I guess it's a premise of our time that this is the only politics they've known. So in that sense, if we look at the Balkan politics, it is partisan. So even if we try to separate it, this is the politics that they have been born and raised into. So it's fair enough that they see it this way and that this is what they're disengaging from. And I think also here for example, in the question of belief in democracy, it's higher than EU averages and European averages, because I think also in the context of the Balkans, democracy has been so pushed because it's so new and so present in the public sphere that they're more comfortable kind of saying that we want this, rather than other countries where democracy has been a fact of life, quote unquote, and then they're able to kind of disengage from it because they don't know just how fragile the whole concept is in a way. So I think here, that's why our Gen Zs are different from the global Gen Zs. And I think it's an interesting kind of comparison with the two.
Thank you, Lura. I have few more things to say, but I will leave them for later. Now we have one question from the chat. Did you ask questions regarding the environment and climate? And then Anastas has his virtual hand raised. So, Anastas, can you also ask your question? And maybe we can collect one more.
Thank you, Borjan, for hosting this, and thanks a lot, Lura, for presenting the very relevant, very interesting, very stimulating research you have done. I have a very simple, generic question, or maybe like a question that has two parts. But let's say going into it, was there any kind of assumption that you had that was like very wildly challenged, or any finding that really changed how you saw things, not necessarily based on previous findings, but any kind of super strong expectation? And then the other question is, if you do now follow-up surveys, what would you change in terms of like how would you position how would you frame the questions, or what kind of things would you emphasize? I'm asking this because in my project for this fellowship, I tried to kind of rethink what dimensions we look at and how we basically study Gen Z beliefs. Yeah, that's about it for me.
Thank you, Anastas. Lura, please.
So on the environment, although they do agree that pollution affects them a lot, for example, affects their cities, the percentage was not as high as I expected it to be. And I think I've said this in the report. I think this is because we did the surveys in the summer. I think if we had done them in the winter, we would have better responses, because I think then you smell the air. So there's also something to be said about the time frame of the surveys. Don't do them in the summer, I guess. people are more optimistic and hopeful, maybe. I don't know. But do them in winter when people are depressed. They can be more truthful. That's also answering Anastas's question. But I think another thing, for example, on the environment, we also see in global trends that the interest in the environment is decreasing with Gen Zs because of the cost of living crisis. So we can also see in the EU survey that environment is degrading in the list of concerns. It's no longer top because most youth are actually getting more worried about the prices and the inflation and what all of this means. But in terms of for example, what to do about the environment, I found it quite interesting when we separate by country, and this is not in the report, but for example, countries like Montenegro, I think Serbia, had more, they gave the responsibility to governments to handle, for example, the environment. And I think it was either Albania or Kosovo, I will have to double check, that gave more responsibility to businesses and companies. This would be something I would explore further, for example, where the duty is seen to belong. And of course, a lot of them saw it as individual. The majority of them saw the responsibility as individual. So the capitalist kind of narrative has taken full hold. So in terms of assumptions and kind of things I went into, I did expect a gender gap. I thought the global trend would also be present in the Balkans. I did expect men to be much more conservative. I expected at least some sort of kind of area where men and women differed considerably. There was none. There was very few questions that you have more than a 5% difference, between men and women. Generally, another assumption was that I thought we would see more variation between countries, but mostly genders and ages, and there isn't much variation. Even with ages, there is very little variation, although the life experiences are quite different. For example, the older cohort didn't even see themselves as Gen Z. When we asked them in the focus group discussions, I noticed that sometimes they spoke of Gen Z as being someone else entirely and not them. Because, they, for example, with some of the older cohorts, they already had families. And it seemed like the moment they have families, they're no longer, they have children. Yes. For example, the women would be like, oh, but now I have children. So, I don't concern myself with Gen Z stuff. Or, men would say like, we have more responsibilities now. So the lack of gender differences for me was an assumption that was basically there and then not substantiated. I did expect a disinterest, for example, in politics, or, also not so many perhaps clear answers in ideology. But I didn't expect this level of disinterest. And I didn't expect, for example, I think the narrative of politics has completely shifted. I think here there is a need to understand the world in new terms, in Gen Z terms, because I think, and this is what I find, for example, in the beginning, I entered the research with this idea of, transition, Gen Zs don't talk about transition because they have seen this is what they were born into, and for us, we expect this kind of gradation, this progress, So in that sense, this is the reality they've known. And I think in the case, especially of the Western Balkans, considering that all these countries are also new in this form and shape and kind of way to be, it's quite interesting. In the case of Kosovo, for example, you have people who signed up as being Kosovar, 30%. This is not something small because a lot of Kosovars wouldn't identify as Kosovars. They would say they're Albanian by ethnicity. The fact that you have Gen Zers saying they're Kosovar by ethnicity, this has shocked a lot of Kosovars, for example, here, because they didn't expect to see people identify ethnically as being Kosovar. So this is also because Kosovo has been a state for their life's duration. So, they see it as more normal identifying with being Kosovar than being Albanian. So in that sense, things are shifting for Gen Z specifically here. But I also think when we look at methodology, there needs to be a way where we check for our own progression statistics. I think generally we think things are going to get better and people are going to get more X, more Y based on our experience. But I think we need to check the way that we frame this from the experience of Gen Z. And here, what I would focus on, I think now looking back at the survey, I think I would have changed a lot of it to reflect more how they expect the future to be like. So I wouldn't ask so many, because in the end, we only had like the last 10 questions that were future oriented in terms of AI. We asked how much they use AI and things like this, but I would actually get a little bit deeper into that and only focus on that aspect and see kind of an exercise of how they see their futures, because I think it's different from how we see our future because of the starting point being different. So that would be something I would be more interested to explore further. Also, sadly, I mean, for example, our futures questions were at the end of the survey. And at the end of the survey, I find that people are less likely to answer interestingly. They answer better, they give better answers at the beginning of the survey when you start than they give at the end of the survey when you're ending, because they just want to get rid of you. Although, I mean, try to make the questions also interesting, because one of the comments we keep getting is on how interesting the questions are. So it's either because, for example, the survey companies would be like, oh, they liked the questionnaire, they thought it was interesting. So keeping questions that keeps Gen Zers engaged is also quite interesting, because they do lose attention quite quickly. But also, when I did the focus group discussions, I was shocked that they would always give me feedback on how interesting the questionnaire was. They'd be like, oh, I enjoyed this so much. And I'd never had a focus group when anybody would tell me, oh, your questionnaire was interesting, or I never thought of this. But to them, these aspects were quite interesting. I don't know if it's because they haven't been surveyed as much as the general population, or they haven't been asked as many questions as the general population. But yeah. I wouldn't say keep the survey short. I thought we would say keep the survey short because all the companies hated me at the end a little bit, I think, because I kept 80 questions. But I think the experience was good. So I wouldn't say go for short questions or short surveys. Just if you have more important indicators, put them at the beginning, but still keep a lot of questions, because I think it keeps kind of the conversation going and a bit more interesting. So don't listen to survey companies when they say only have 15 questions or something. They can still do it with 80 or 60 or 50 or whatever. But, it's important to check for the thing. And another tip for the surveys, please pilot them. I did a lot of pilots. So one, I did a focus group discussion before I started the surveys. So I saw whether these topics actually were being mentioned by Gen Zers at all, whether they care about these things at all. So that really changed the way I pose the questions. And then we also, of course, piloted the survey in the beginning and adjusted accordingly based on what we were getting from the field. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Laura. It's very important that we hear your insights from this whole process, because most of us are currently doing research with young people in one way or another. Now, Vanya,
I think
Anastas, do you have something to add? Sorry?
But we can hear you.
I just want to, I have many other follow-up questions, but one really important on the gender gap. Because the gender gap was not so significant as you expected. Was it because the answers of the male respondents were more, let's say, I don't know, what was your expectation? My expectation would always be that female respondents are a bit more, let's say, open-minded, flexible, whatever. But is it because like the answers you got was the male respondents were more towards let's say this version of answers, or because the female were more conservative or something? Or they met somewhere in the middle? I don't know.
The middle is the tendency of this generation. But I'll take Vanya and Sonia as well, and then I can answer all of them.
Okay. I think it would be better if we sit down for coffee so we can talk more about this. But something that you mentioned is one of my concerns for my research. So my research is more about the migration futures of young people in North Macedonia. And one of my, let's say, notes was that I found out doing the interviews in January and February that most of the concerns of the interviewers were about the pollution and environment. And I think on the flip side of, as you say, my answer were also very much influenced by the daily situation with the air. So maybe it's better that you did it on summer, or maybe it's better to do it in spring or autumn or something like that. Other thing that I also wanted to mention, and this is good because your some of the answers that I got from my research really surprised me. But now with your research, they are just confirmed. It tracks completely. So EU and other stuff. About the engagement, I have something that also I would like to share. Maybe we can talk, and maybe this is also more in line with Borjan's research, and that is about involvement of youth in politics. My questions were more about policy making and their ideas of being involved more broadly in the society, especially politics, policy making, governance, etc. Their ideas were mainly around doing it online. So, being the first generation that are digitally native, they find this space, let's say, that is more in line with their way of, let's say, involvement in the society. So maybe here is something that we can also, this is one of so far, let's say, some of the recommendations that I have on my research, and that is to find a space online where we can engage young people more in the society if we want them more involved in general. So I don't know if you had something like that in the research. Maybe that will be interesting to talk about.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And Sonia?
Hey, congratulations for the research. I remember when it was conceived in Albach. Great work. I have one comment or a question about the understanding of politics and motivation for joining politics. Your research shows that they're not interested and, yeah, ideologically not clearly positioned. There has been a lot of research done in Serbia since the protests started. And one of the findings that came out from different university centers, especially in the first half of the protest, was this apolitical stand in a sense that youth were not didn't trust the institutional channels, did not trust the regular politics. However, the moral trigger, the feeling of injustice, was the main mobilizer. And this is something that I understand from colleagues who did this research is something that the generations in our region share with the global Gen Z. So kind of detachment from regular politics as we know it through parties and institutions, but mobilization around injustice and injustice that could be, a link to the experience. So as you mentioned, local level, also in some cases identity issues. But I understand in your findings show that identity is not something that mobilizes them. So I was wondering, did you get to discuss during focus groups anything about what would motivate them to get active? And also, I'm interested in interstate relations in the region. I've seen a report online at the OSF webpage. And were there any of these discussions in the focus groups? Because I think that's maybe an area for our region to see how conservative, progressive in relation to their parents and grandparents, the generations that is when it comes to interethnic and interstate relations. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you all for the questions. This allows me to go a bit deeper. So on the gender gap, I think it's a little bit of both. I think women were, although they were more tolerant than men, they were still more conservative than I would have expected, particularly on the gender questions as well. Whereas men were a bit less conservative than I would have expected. So I do think it's a middle ground. And I think there's also, if I look at it, there is a tendency to not be extreme with the generation in the Balkans, which is different from the global Gen Z, in the sense of they feel like they don't want to rock the boat too much. although globally, I think Gen Zs do not want to rock the boat until they really rock the boat, like in the Nepalese case. But they do have this preference for stability, which I find very not expected in a young generation. And I don't know if this is the cost of living crisis. I don't know if it's the poly crisis, but they want a little bit of stability. So I think like they gravitate more towards kind of a middle ground. And I think the answer to most of your questions is more kind of me stepping away a little bit from the data and looking more into the larger picture. So in terms of, for example, the involvement of youth in politics, I get the sense that, for example, we asked the question on direct democracy, and people are a bit skeptical about this because they're like, oh, but they won't understand what that means. So we have a lot of people who said yes, but there's naysayers who say they don't like it, and they just said yes for the sake of it. I tend to not agree because I think there's a lot of answers of I don't know that we have through the questionnaire that shows that these people are not shy to say that they don't know something. So in that sense, I think direct democracy, and here digital democracy would come in this sense, would be an option to pursue, as well as taking politics down to the local level. Gen Zers, in my impression, especially in the Balkans, they don't have a strong sense of community. Their only community is their friends and their basically family. That's why family is so important. They don't have a lot of understanding of kind of a more communal understanding of issues. And I think this is what also is blocking their engagement, which is where I would see, if I wanted to engage more with Gen Z, this is where I would start. And this is where I'm thinking more of starting, in the sense of rebuilding local physical communities, because this is what they don't necessarily have. I think here COVID was very crucial. The fact that, in a very important age, when you go to university and you go to high school and you meet new people, these guys stayed at home. I think this kind of informed the reason why they have more close-knit communities. But it's a generation in the Balkans where family and their opinions really matter a lot. So it's not this, I feel like for the millennial generation, it was do anything other than what your parents say. So it was more, like of a rebellious kind of, or more peer pressure generation. This is more of a family pressure generation. So I would say take politics local, and of course take it digital, because Instagram and TikTok are the way that they're getting their political news. And if you're not on Instagram and TikTok and you're writing traditional news, I think we're missing out. And I think a lot of political parties get this wrong. Although, to be honest, in Kosovo, they've been very good. I think with the last local elections, in many cities, the local candidates, they had very good TikTok accounts. And I think this kind of engaged a lot of young people, and also engaged discussion on certain topics, because I was following closely. But also Kosovo is also a different case in the sense of how they engage with politics. I think in the case of Kosovo, they have so much this idea of we are building a state that is still alive with the Gen Z generation. I didn't expect that. That they are able to kind of engage in a different way that I find in other countries. Feelings of injustice and what could mobilize them. We didn't ask what would mobilize them in this sense, but I think this issue of having generally a more dignified life, I think is a key aspect for them. So the idea of living a life and not surviving a life is very important to them. And I think around this, you can, of course, build a frame of injustice. You can bring a frame of precarity as well, which I think needs to be kind of more worked on, in the sense of how to translate this for Gen Z. But I think the idea of having a dignified life is quite strong. And for example, in one of the focus group discussions, I think in Montenegro, I believe it was like, we want to stay, but staying shouldn't be about surviving. It shouldn't be that we survive. We should, have a dignified and thriving life. And here they do in a way that I think other generations before them haven't, because of the politics of the Western Balkans. But I think having a generation that entirely grew up with these institutions as they are now also allows them to frame this in institutional terms. So, for example, healthcare, education, and things like that are very strong in their kind of priority list. And this is, again, because of a personal experience. And I think if we shift this personal experience to a communal understanding, coming back to locals, is what I think will get Gen Z involved. And Vanya, please reach out to me on migration, because Macedonia was one of the more depressing ones in terms of migration and wanting to leave, I'm sorry to say. I think it was one of the lower percentages in terms of the people who want to stay, but also in the focus group discussions, I think 1 in 3 people would raise their hand that they wanted to leave the country. So Macedonia is a bit different, and I'd be happy to share more data. But yeah, I mean, generally, the sense I get from Gen Zs is that we have the sense that Gen Zs have an easy life or easier life than us, but I don't think it is an easy life, in the sense that they have been raised in kind of an institutional and broad economic and is kind of societal development that we have not prepared them for at all. So changes are happening very rapidly. Markets are shifting rapidly. Institutions are shifting rapidly. And then none of us have the tools to handle this at all. So I do not envy the position of Gen Zs and what they're having. I thought it was interesting that they are so optimistic about the AI developments. Most of the people I know are not. We all think we're going to be jobless soon. But for Gen Zs, for example, they saw this as an exciting development. So it could be that they're getting more used to adapting and integrating technology into their lives. This would be something I would explore further, especially considering that we don't have any state that is prepared for the AI revolution, let's say. But this is, politically speaking, maybe the issue of the generation moving forward, both the local and the digital, and how they can come together.
We have a little bit more time. Dragana, please.
Hi, I'll be quick. Thank you so much, Lura. This was so amazing. I enjoyed it and tried to connect with my study as well. So, did you ask among these 80 questions any question about Gen Z views of immigrants? Because we know, like the new dynamics in the region. So I really appreciate your questions about their intention to migrate and maybe not. But what about their views about immigrants? To the region, and also if there was a rule about religion, how did you frame this type of question? Because maybe that somehow could be tied with the conservative part of the social attitudes and whatnot. So anyways, I have many more questions, but I will try to get in touch with you outside of the seminar. So I wish you all the best. Thank you so much for this study.
Thank you, Dragana. Actually, I did have a question on the migration of other workers, but we removed it in the workshop because we thought there was too many issues. But we actually had two, both on migrants affecting the cultural scene and the political or social scene. And then we decided when we were cutting the questions to cut those out. And I'm sorry we did, because I think it's the issue of the future. But no, we didn't have those in the end. In terms of questions on your second question was on sorry,
religion, the one about religion, right? Yeah.
So we did have, basically FES in their research had this, they had how often you go to mosque or church. And then they also had, for example, virginity and religion were very high up in how do you choose a partner. Which kind of was framed in the sense of the influence of religion. I didn't want to choose. We did ask how religious you are to just self-identify. I think a majority do consider themselves religious. Not so many consider themselves as very religious. I don't have this question in the report, so I can send you the data. But the reason I don't have it in the report is because then religion doesn't seem to figure in any of the other frames. So, for example, their conservative or traditional values were not so much framed in religious terms. They were more kind of framed in the sense of family and tradition. And so, and that's why I decided to keep the religion out of it, because I felt like it's not an explanatory factor. It's not giving me anything new. And it also, for example, we asked what they would like in a partner, and religious views were, I think, bottom of the list. It was either personal alignment, virginity was also bottom of the list. I think sometimes also in looking at surveys, I would say give more options, because if in terms of investigating some of the answers, sometimes it's the nature of the answers given. And if you have like 3 that you can choose, you're going to choose one, and then, because it seems to explain things closest. So we had a lot of options of what people could choose, because we wanted to have, we didn't want people to just go to religion or just go to one, because the options were so limited. The survey companies maybe also didn't like this, but I had a lot of open questions, because I wanted to see what comes out of the young people. And here the plus side is that you get more of a view, but sometimes you just get very small percentages, like in the leadership or personality question, but it's still indicative, because I think if I had put names, I would put Andrew Tate, for example, or some people like that. But Andrew Tate was not in any of the lists. And people who I expected to be in the list were not in the list, which means we also think things about Gen Z that might not actually be at all part of their vocabulary. It's just our perception. So also in this case, having open questions is also useful. And this, Anastas already left, but it might be useful for him. This having open questions, even though it is burdensome in the coding phase, it's still very valuable, because if you don't know a generation, or if you don't have baseline data, it's the best way to understand, because otherwise I feel like we're giving words to the generation without really understanding them. So yeah, the religion in the end, I thought it was not an explanatory factor, so I left it out. I don't know if I did the right thing, but I feel like I did. It really wasn't a factor, yeah.
Thank you, Lura. This was a top-notch discussion. We opened many different aspects, and there is so much potential for various angles of further research and analysis. And I think I will contact you for some co-authorship. I just first need to author my work, and then see what comes next. Once again, thank you all for joining us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for the lively participation, and I hope we'll have opportunity to meet soon in person and further discuss this kind of interesting things. Thank you, Lura, one more time.
Thank you, Borjan. Thank you, everyone, for the amazing questions. And yes, please feel free to reach out to me if you have like detailed questions on anything.
Thank you. See you next week.
See you next week. Enjoy Easter holiday for those who have it. Yeah.
Happy Easter.
Ciao.
Ciao.